William Altman is an independent scholar and the author of the five-volume series Plato the Teacher, a major rereading of Plato's dialogues as a unified educational curriculum. The final volume in that series, Ascent to the Beautiful, covers the dialogues leading up to and culminating in the Symposium. Before turning to full-time scholarship, William spent over 3 decades as a public high school teacher in Vermont, California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia, where he taught history, philosophy, English, drama, Latin, and ancient Greek. He holds degrees in philosophy from Wesleyan University, the University of Toronto, and the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina in Brazil. And he received his doctorate in 2010. He is also the author of books on Nietzsche, Heidegger, Leo Strauss, and Cicero, and currently divides his time between Vermont and Florianópolis, Brazil. William, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Joshua.
So, my first question is, why philosophy and why Plato in particular? How did you get started on this journey?
Well, Joshua, I think I'd like to dodge that question for right now. I think it will emerge as we talk, but if you'd be so kind as to ask me that at the very end, that would work better for me.
Okay.
Um,
Well, for anyone who hasn't read the Symposium, or maybe hasn't read it in a long time, can you set the scene for us? What actually is happening in the dialogue and why has it endured for nearly 2,400 years?
well, I think the best way to begin is just to say, if you've ever told anybody that likes you that you'd prefer to keep your relationship platonic, or if you have ever been told that your relationship should be kept platonic, even though that's not what you want, then that's a very good reason for reading Plato's Symposium, because there wouldn't be such a thing as let's keep our relationship platonic if it weren't for Plato's Symposium. Um, so, in a way, that's the answer. But I'll go a little farther. Is when you read the Symposium, it's pretty obvious that it resembles what we would call a play. It's got a number of characters and it's got a large cast. Everybody has a scene, a speech. The easy thing to forget is that all of ancient drama, comedy, and tragedy alike was written in verse. And in fact, it would be more than 1,500 years later that a play, what we would call a play, would be written in prose. In other words, Plato's dialogues with the Symposium, probably at their head because it is so theatrical and makes allusions to the theater as well, is the first play written in prose for more than one, the first ever and the last for well more than a millennia. And just in that regard, that makes it very important. In thinking about it, I think the three things that come to mind in dealing with the Symposium are, first of all, its tremendous variety. It's got something in there for everybody because the speeches are numerous and the characters are indelibly drawn. There's a great deal of variety. The Symposium format allows that. And there's a certain vivacity, to continue with my letter V. It's a lively dialogue in which you come away, even though there's no back narrative to tell you that Joshua was a tall, lanky fellow with glasses or any kind of stage directions. It manages to be incredibly vivid. So between its variety and its vividness. And then finally, I guess in dealing with ancient philosophy, especially Plato, I guess you'd have to throw in the letter V with the word virtue. I think that the dialogue is, in some sense, trying to teach you how to be a better person. I think that Plato, in general, was trying to do that. So between its virtue, its vivacity, and its variety, you've got an amazing prose drama that is the source of one of the best known relationship words on the planet, the platonic love, a platonic relationship.
Mhm. So, as you're alluding to, it's a drama, it's a play, but it's done in prose. So, is it a philosophical treatise? Is it comedy? Is it tragedy? Like, how do we categorize it, or how could we say how do we describe this text?
Well, so I think I think probably the best single word is that it's a classic. Um, but what the word classic really means. The definition I used to teach my high school students was based on a passage in Plutarch where Plutarch was talking about the buildings on the Parthenon, and he said that though now they're very old, they still have the bloom of freshness and newness upon them. And that to me is what a classic is. It's something very old that nevertheless seems completely new. And the genre bending that goes on in a dialogue like the Symposium. Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Is it a work of philosophy? Is it a play? Is it a drama? Is it a joke? Is it serious? These are all questions that anybody could say any one of those. So great is its variety. I think the safest thing to say about it is that it is a classic. But since it directly implicates the great Athenian drama, and remember that the Athenians, of which Plato was a proud son of Athens, is that they invented drama. Like they literally invented tragedy and then comedy. So, and both tragedy and comedy are mentioned in the dialogue, not least of all because it takes place as a victory celebration for a young man named Agathon, and there's just won the prize for tragedy. And by far and away, the most famous Athenian comic poet is present in the form of Aristophanes. And at the end of the drama, where Socrates is trying to persuade the drunk comedian and the drunk tragedian that if they really had a techne, really had an art that allowed them to do either of the things that they do well, they should be able to do both, which, by the way, they never did. Aristophanes never wrote a tragedy and Agathon never wrote a comedy. That's so great as the genre, although there is some gender bending going on, actually, come to think of it, that's so great as the genre bending in Plato's Symposium, it would be very difficult to classify. And so I would say that it is a classic, and precisely because there's nothing like it that's modern. It's very old, but yet it's ultra modern as well as being very, very old.
Amazing. And it attests to the mastery of the author himself, right? And even at the end of the dialogue, right, where he's giving that in the voice of Socrates, right, talking about how one should be able to bend the two genres, right? So it's almost he's referring to his own mastery in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's an interesting guy, Plato, because nobody ever made a greater effort to conceal himself. He never really speaks in any of his dialogues. All of his dialogues, of which there are 35, most of them based around the character of Socrates. People have wondered whether Socrates speaks for Plato. Well, no. Plato conceals himself from those from whom he wishes to conceal himself. I think when you spend a lot of time with him, as I have, you start to get a pretty clear sense of who he was and what he was like. And what you just indicated, in other words, that between the lines, he's saying, I'm a pretty good writer, because, this is the greatest tragedian in Athens. This is the greatest comedian. And I'm basically saying I can do both of them. Of course, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say I could do both of them. So he can't be accused of boasting. You can't accuse a guy of boasting who never makes any first person statements. And yet, there is a kind of comic element to it where you start to realize just how playful, how funny, and how brilliant Plato is. I think just to answer your question is that if Plato weren't the most famous philosopher, if he weren't the greatest philosopher, he would still be one of the greatest writers that ever picked up a stylus. He can pretty much do anything that he wants with a pen. And Plato's Symposium is a really good proof of that, because he, in a series of speeches, without any third-person descriptions of what Eryximachus looked like or how he spoke, but merely through his words, he has given these absolutely vivid portraits of people. So a great dramatist and a great writer and a great philosopher.
So speaking on that topic of the image of the picture that he's painting, one thing that surprises people about this particular text in relationship to the other dialogues is the setting. This isn't Socrates in the marketplace where we often see him interrogating people. It's at somebody's party. It's in a private home, a poet's house with wine and garlands and flute girls and that are being sent away. So why does Plato choose this particular setting for presenting some of his most important philosophical ideas?
Well, that's a terribly complicated question, and it impl the there are two things that a Plato scholar has to say about the Symposium. Number one, it's such a delightful work that it really stands alone. It can be profitably read by somebody that's read no other Plato or no other ancient literature. They can pick it up. They can be delighted by the half humans of the Aristophanes or the great comic potential of the Alcibiades interruption, the beauty of Socrates' own speech, of course, the vividness of the party that you just described. And that, even a neophyte or beginner can pick this up and find it delightful. But in fact, it's one of 35 dialogues that Plato wrote, and not the first, not the one that he would have wanted his students to read first. Perhaps he might have wanted them to perform in it first, because it's got some wonderful speaking parts that make some demands on young actors that are quite fun. But it's not the first. And that the dialogue that seems to be a much better introduction, which is called the Protagoras, which begins at dawn, is very close to the Symposium in certain ways. All of the characters that appear in the Symposium appear in the Protagoras, except Aristophanes, the comic poet. And when you really understand the Protagoras, you understand that Aristophanes is present because it's one of Plato's greatest comedies. In fact, it's a greater comedy than the Symposium is. The Symposium, although it's a comedy, is also a tragedy, whereas I don't think anybody would want to claim that about the Protagoras, which is pretty much as close to straight up comedy as Plato is going to come. Well, no, that's too strong. But at any rate, to really think about why the Symposium takes place, why and where and when it does, would involve a more complicated appreciation of all of Plato's dialogues, starting with the Protagoras, but by no means ending with that. Let's just say that the Symposium format, which had already been exploited by Plato's pal Xenophon, admits of just tremendous variety, and that clearly writing a work of art that possessed the qualities of vivacity and variety while teaching you something about virtue was pretty clearly Plato's goal, because he achieved it so perfectly. And so that particular scene that lends itself to variety, because you have different speakers in turn going on and making their speeches, and all in a slightly drunken setting, which promotes the kind of playful, delightful ambiance of the piece. I think those are the kinds of things with which I'd answer your question without going into the more complicated question of how Symposium fits into the corpus Platonicum as a whole.
So on the topic of those speeches, in your book, I know you've written about and as you alluded to just before, like the role of in terms of rhetoric and in terms of the speeches being performed themselves, and of course the role of the dialogue as a teaching instrument as well. So when somebody is engaged with the dialogue, they feel like it seems to culminate in something. So somebody may fall into maybe possibly the error of thinking that the first five speeches are just laying the groundwork, or they're kind of, you have to get over them to get to what he's ultimately trying to get to with Diotima. So are we supposed to take those speeches seriously, or are they just warm-up acts for Socrates?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there are I guess there are three things that I would say in regard to that. The first is that my series of 5 books is called Plato the Teacher for a reason. What I'm arguing is that Plato is a teacher and that the dialogues were the instruments through which he taught. So to teach adolescents, as I did for 30 years, I can tell you that if you stand up there as a boring professor, reading off your lecture notes, you're not going to be a successful teacher. And Plato wrote dialogues because they're entertaining, and he made them entertaining because he was a teacher. And the fact that they're entertaining proves that he's a great teacher. So that I think I guess that's the first thing. Um, the second thing it slips my mind, but there was something. Did it have to do with a curriculum? I can't remember exactly, but let's skip directly to the third. Oh no, I remember. Now I remember is when you mentioned rhetoric, and of course this is a dialogue about speeches, so each of these guys is an accomplished speaker in their own way, including Socrates, but all of them really. One of the things that makes Plato so much fun as a teacher is that 90% of people that think they know anything about Plato will tell you that Plato hated rhetoric. And I mean, I understand why they think that. I mean, he wrote a whole dialogue called the Gorgias, in which Socrates attacks rhetoric as kind of the equivalent of pastry cook makers, as opposed to people that give you health food. In other words, that just give you kind of sugary sweets to delight your palate. One of the things that truly makes Plato fascinating is, well, Cicero put it best, I think. Cicero was a great Platonist and said one of the cleverest things that anybody's ever said about Plato, which is he has one of his characters in one of his dialogues say, what impressed me most was that Plato was never so eloquent, that his rhetoric was never so excellent as when he was attacking rhetoric in the Gorgias. As Shakespeare would say, how well he's read to reason against reading. One of the ongoing jokes about Plato is that he has his Socrates keep saying things like, rhetoric is bad, or imitation is a mistake, or so imitate. Here we've got one of the first prose dramas ever written, this vivid recreation of Athens, this dinner party, this victory celebration, where you indelibly see all of these characters and even hear the absent flute girls and the drunken crowds outside. And it's written by a guy that, if you take him literally, is against imitation on principle. A guy that attacked poetry and banished the poets from his city. And I hate to say it, but most Plato scholars, even Plato scholars, tend to think that that's what Plato thought, that Plato was against rhetoric. Nothing, what could I say? I won't say nothing could be farther from the truth, but certainly the fact that he is teaching rhetoric while at the same time saying that rhetoric is bad, or the same way that he's teaching virtue even when his lead character says that virtue cannot be taught. And even though he's imitating this dinner party, even though his lead character makes an eloquent series of speeches against imitation on principle, even though one of the greatest writers that ever lived in the Phaedrus makes a long discourse about how writing is a waste of time, that when you enter into the world of Plato and start realizing that these things are jokes, you actually have the opportunity to leave behind a long series of graybeards and professors, et cetera, that have taken all of these statements rather literally and at best try to show how they need to be nuanced a little bit instead of biting the bullet and saying, come on, guys, he was bullshitting, like that his actions are directly contradicting what he's doing, and he knows that. As if I were to say, I'm sorry that non posso falar português. It's not just that I'm waiting for somebody to contradict me, it's that I'm contradicting myself. And then the third point, in the Phaedrus that I mentioned a minute before, Plato's Socrates introduces an interesting word, which in English we'd say logographic necessity. Necessitadi logographicae, which basically means that in a well-written text, not one word is out of place. And by definition, the speech of Phaedrus is designed to come first. And it's designed to be followed by the speech of Pausanias. And no, we don't skip directly to Diotima and Socrates, because logographic necessity, invented by the guy that invented the word in one of his most artistically successful dialogues, you can well bet that nothing in there is adventitious. There were a few years ago, there was a conference dedicated to the symposium in which people were encouraged to take a speech and to write about that. And I immediately realized that, there were some speeches that were going to be popular. A lot of people would want to write about Socrates. Even more, I speculated, would want to write about Aristophanes or Alcibiades. And I figured the one that the least number of people would want to write about was the Phaedrus, which is the first one. And I still think so. And the Phaedrus ends up being an incredibly important speech. The single most important word in the dialogue, which is the Greek word huper apothnesken, which means to die on behalf of someone else, which I take to be the essence of nobility. And remember that the subject that all of these guys are talking about eros. They're all talking about what love is. But Socrates shifts into talking about what the object of love is. And what ends up being the object of love is what in Greek is called to kalon, which is usually translated as the beautiful, but which could also be translated as the noble, the excellent, the morally beautiful. The gallant is my personal favorite, because it relates directly to gallantry. In other words, to huper apothnesken, to die on behalf of someone. And the Phaedrus speech has these beautiful passages about Alcestis, the wife of a man by the name of Admetus, when his own parents wouldn't die on his behalf to save him from death, that she stepped forward and died for love on behalf of her husband. It's one of the most sublime moments in the dialogue, and that you can't even understand Diotima's speech fully unless you fully embrace the message of the Phaedrus. And I mention the Phaedrus only because it's the most despised of the speeches. Though so despised was it that my abstract on the Phaedrus wasn't accepted, because there was no attention was given to the Phaedrus whatsoever in this particular conference. So logographic necessity, performative self-contradiction, and Plato the Teacher, because nothing is more entertaining than performative self-contradiction. It's just that when a student gets the joke, they have a teacher that they'll love for life.
Beautiful. There's almost like a concentricity to the dialogues in a way where like you have something in the beginning ties to something at the end, and I mean, I guess that this is the nature of any masterful writer, right? That they're weaving in these themes, and you have to see the text as a whole. So although it might feel linear, it's not necessarily the case. You have to go back and you have to weave things together to really understand the bigger picture.
Well, I mean, and Plato being the teacher that he is, when we get to dialogues that are a lot more complicated than the Symposium is, the Symposium can stand alone. You can give that to a group of upper high school students, certainly college students, and they can be delighted by it, amused by it, outraged by it, and enter into very interesting debates about it. There's certainly dialogues of Plato that are more complicated than that. But in the dialogue, the Cratylus, he deals with this. Like, it's very direct. It's like you have to read backwards and forwards, he says. You have to see what, and in fact, he's already taught you to read backwards and forwards long before he actually makes it explicit. And so what you're saying about the Symposium, about this concentric nature to it and reading backwards and forwards, just imagine the incredible complexity that comes when you're talking about all 35 dialogues. That the richness, the complexity. There really aren't that many books that compare with the dialogues of Plato, leaving now aside the beauty of the way they're written and the philosophical content of them. Is that just the sheer complexity of them. Shakespeare, the Bible, these are the only things that compare. The Bible, which is this, massive book spanning, this huge period of time with all of these characters where, Jesus's name is Joshua. Joshua is the assistant of Moses, like where you get these very, very rich, complicated things. I'd have to say Plato's more so. And even though Shakespeare was a great dramatist, writing, by the way, both comedies and tragedies and various other genres, I'm not totally sure that he's more complicated. He's certainly our greatest writer in English. He's our closest thing to Plato, or to put it better, the closest thing to Plato in English is not Gilbert Ryle or Bertrand Russell or it's not David Hume or John Locke or Bishop Berkeley or any of the famous philosophers that wrote in English. The closest to Plato is Shakespeare, and the complexity is amazing. And these 5 speeches or 6 or 7, I think they're 7, is just a perfect example of the skill with which he wrote and the complexity with which he enlivened his dialogues.
Hmm. So to dive a little bit more deeply into the dialogues themselves, since we're in that territory now, and you mentioned that the speech of Aristophanes is when you went to this conference, for example, that you thought, oh, that might be one of the most popular ones, because it definitely speaks to modern sensibilities, or the modern kind of collective unconscious of the desire to find your other half. So it's a part of the popular culture. And it's interesting what Plato does in the text, right, where he flips the position of Aristophanes with Eryximachus, right? And what do you think? What do you think he's doing with that one in particular? Because it seems like there's definitely a component, an element in it that is relevant to the later part of the dialogue when Diotima steps in. But the caricaturization, in this text, the comedy of it is really interesting. So what is he doing there? What is he challenging?
Well, look, I mean, the you bring so so unlike the other characters in the like, so for example, Agathon, who's just won the prize, we don't have his tragedy anymore. It's been lost. Aristophanes is in a different category. We've got 11 full comedies of Aristophanes and the names of many others. So Aristophanes is a writer that can be judged on his own merits. And when you put a famous author in your book and make him a character in your book, as Plato's doing to Aristophanes, you had better be true to him. If he's the greatest comic poet that Athens produced, you better come up with something pretty funny that he said in the Symposium. And I think Plato did that. He takes him to a genre that Aristophanes didn't, because Aristophanes was actually making fun of real people. I mean, maybe they were masked, but he certainly could never conjure up an image of a primordial global person with 4 arms and 4 legs that then Zeus cuts in half. In a way, Plato outdoes Aristophanes on Aristophanes' home ground, and attributes it to Aristophanes as a compliment. It's a delightfully funny thing. So, and it needed to be, if he was going to do any kind of justice to Aristophanes, who would have his admirers and who would dislike Plato if he didn't give Aristophanes a funny speech. I think that what needs to be said by me is that just as we wouldn't know what Platonic love is if it weren't for the Symposium. So in other words, there's a phrase that everybody knows, everybody uses, everybody's heard it, either on the receiving end or the giving end. We all know it. The word that comes to mind here is the word idea. So we all know what an idea is. We have an idea of the idea. In other words, an idea is a mental conception in my mind. Now, Plato invented the word idea. He's the first guy to use the word idea in the sense that it turns into the way we use it. And yet it's exactly the opposite. For Plato, an idea is not your own personal subjective conception of beauty. The whole idea of beauty is that it's an idea. It's an external, excellent thing. I mean, in a way, Plato's philosophy is very boneheaded. If you ask, what is beautiful? Well, it'd be beautiful to win the World Series, or it'd be beautiful to win the Super Bowl, or a beautiful horse is beautiful, or a beautiful woman, or a beautiful man. They're beautiful. What is beautiful? Beauty. This is Plato's answer. What is truly beautiful? Even if you wake him up or wake her up at 3 o'clock in the morning after she's had 5 beers, what is truly beautiful? Beauty. And it's the only thing that is truly and ineluctably beautiful. It's an idea, and it's external to the mind. It's something that we climb a ladder in order to see. It's external. Now, look, the reason that Aristophanes and that Alcibiades capture the modern sensibility is that the modern sensibility isn't particularly Platonic. Not only do most Plato scholars not believe in the Platonic idea, but most philosophy professors are not, unless they're writing about the Bible, and even then, in some cases, not. God as an external creator than which nothing greater can be conceived or even imagined. That's not on the top of their hit parade. They're interested in logic, philosophy of mathematics, epistemology, advanced metaphysics, ontological inquiry, and all sorts of other grand sounding names. So the idea that there's something external that is the great thing, you can really understand why modern people prefer Aristophanes to Diotima, because what he's saying is we once were whole. We once were whole, and we're all looking for our other half. And we would achieve happiness if we could reunite with our primitive nature. And all we have to do is get back to where we once belonged. And that's what it's all about. And so this is as Cooper said in a poem, a pleasing doctrine, plausible and new. What fools our fathers were, if this be true. The external idea is what Plato is trying to lead you to. That's why it's called the Platonic idea. It's his big idea, quite literally. It's like his idea was the idea. And Aristophanes delivers a very, very funny, comic alternative to locating the good outside of yourself. And that's what it's doing in the dialogue. And by the way, it's the only speech. No, that's not quite fair. The two speeches that are directly referenced by Diotima, in other words, by Socrates speaking through Diotima, because remember, just as Plato speaks through Socrates, Socrates speaks through Diotima. In fact, the literary complexity, let's not even go into it right now. Let's just say for now that the speech of Phaedrus on the issue of Hooper apothnesken is that's directly referenced in a way that looks like it's refuting Phaedrus, and it doesn't. It actually elevates the Phaedrus and makes his speech loftier, actually, than Diotima. The opposite is true for the other speech that she mentions, which is Aristophanes, where where basically the idea that unless you're going to say that the good is part of you, then Aristophanes' whole conception of getting back to yourself is misguided, because what we really love is what's truly beautiful and good. That's what we truly love.
So before we get to actually what was said by Socrates and Diotima, and after Aristophanes, we have Agathon, right, who talks about love it's almost again an inversion of Phaedrus, because Phaedrus talks about love as the oldest, right? And then Agathon comes in and says, no, actually, the contrary, love is the youngest. I'm getting that right, right?
Mhm.
And so he gives this really beautiful, rhetorically polished speech, gets a standing ovation, and then Socrates comes in and totally dismantles it. And that's where we have this shift, or the kind of a turning point in the dialogue itself. So what's going on in that contrast in the speech of Agathon?
Well, so look, that's a nicely phrased question. It would be very complicated to do it justice. A few things to be said. Agathon's a young man, and he part of the dramatic setting is he's just won the prize, but he's in a committed homosexual relationship with a man by the name of Pausanias, who's there and delivers a speech on his own. And there's a lot of heterosexual, homosexual talk. And it's one of the things that makes the dialogue seem so modern. So remember that with those Aristophanes characters, where they were originally, globular and had 4 arms and 4 legs, is that some of them were completely male, and they turn into male homosexual lovers, and some of them were completely female, and they turn into lesbian homosexual lovers. And then there are those that were originally both male and female, presumably the majority of them, and they are looking for their other half in a heterosexual relationship. So all of that is going on. Agathon is a very handsome young man who is he's probably too old to refer to the relationship as pederastic, but he's been the boyfriend of Pausanias since he was a kid. So, and this was very typical in ancient Greece. In fact, Plato's a major source for it. Source, and we'll get into that, I think, a little later. But but in addition to that whole sexual element, I mean, the word agathon means good. So is he the good? We all love Agathon. We're there to celebrate his victory. We all love Agathon. Does that mean we love the good? Well, it's not the idea of the good. It's the good in this temporarily embodied form of this very brilliant young man that delivers this beautifully rhetorically gifted speech, who's just won the prize to great applause. The standing ovation he gets in front of these wise guys at the house of Agathon is nothing compared to the standing ovation he just received at the theater of Dionysius, where he won the great prize. So he's the center. Like they're there because of him. They're there because of him. In Xenophon's Symposium, they're there because of a young guy that's just won a race. But that young kid never even talks, or very seldom, makes only a few little comments. Here in Agathon, he gets one of the most brilliant speeches that's ever been written. So look, it's the most rhetorical in the obvious sense of all of the speeches.
Hmm.
There were great teachers of rhetoric in ancient Greece. One of them was a guy by the name of Gorgias. He was a Sicilian from Leontini. He's clearly the teacher of Agathon. We know enough about him, even though he really only survives in fragments, although two pretty lengthy ones. We have a good idea of what Gorgianic rhetoric looked like. And anybody that writes about Gorgianic rhetoric, one of their most important sources is going to be the speech of Agathon in Plato's Symposium. So while Plato is the guy that can write this speech and therefore is obviously a master of rhetoric, you can understand why the majority think that he's against rhetoric, because rhetoric in this form, where it's a lot of flowery phrases and paradoxical clauses and so forth, and so we're going to have to get into the details, that if that's what persuasive speaking is, well, then you could see that Plato doesn't think that's the highest good. So that on the one hand, you get a contrast between rhetoric and substance. In other words, that where Agathon represents the rhetoric, and Agathon represents the seeming versus the reality. Socrates, this is something Plato loves. Like, would you rather appear to be good or to actually be good? Like, which is better, seeming or reality? And so, as Socrates says at one point, well, you've given a very seemly speech. It seems good, but I thought we were supposed to speak the truth. So that contrast between truth and seeming runs through it, and that of course relates to falsehood and truth. So all of these things are in play where Socrates not only, I think I should put that differently, where Plato not only allows Socrates to speak directly after Agathon, but in fact stages Socrates' entire speech as a dialogue with Agathon, not just because it's at his house, not just because his name is the good, not just because he's this beautiful young man in this committed homosexual relationship with Pausanias. All of these things are in play, but I think that the deeper point has to do with these contrasts that I was talking about earlier: rhetoric and substance, truth and falsity, seeming and being.
Right. So at that point, right, transitioning from Agathon, as you just described, Socrates sort of dismantles and tries to get back to the essence or the intention. And maybe this is where he changes, like you said in the beginning, from talking about or describing the characteristics of Eros to transitioning to the object of Eros, right? So we get to the heart of the dialogue, which is Socrates' speech, but he's not actually really giving a speech aside from dismantling Agathon's. Instead, he recounts his conversation with Diotima, the priestess from Mantinea, and there's probably some interesting things we can say about the etymology of those words, who he says taught him everything about love. So why does Plato have Socrates attribute his seemingly his deepest, most essential secret teaching to someone else and to a woman, especially in this very homoerotic scene?
Yeah, great. Well, so I think the first thing that needs to be said there is, I mean, right from the beginning, I emphasized that we wouldn't have Platonic love without Plato. We wouldn't have the word idea the way we use it without Plato, even though he uses it in a different way. Another thing I think that needs to be said is that Plato is the first person in the history of mankind that makes a standing argument for the equality of the sexes. In Republic, Book 5, the guardians of the city are going to receive this special training because they're going to need to be gentle to their friends, but terrible to their foes because they're soldiers. And he makes clear that women are going to be given the same philosophic and military training that men are. And he defends the equality of the sexes there in a way that nobody's going to do for, till Mary Shelley. It's a funny thing about Plato scholarship because if you go online and look at what people write about Plato and the equality of the sexes, you find book after book showing that he doesn't believe in the equality of the sexes as much as we've always thought that he did. Well, look, nobody thought that any of these other guys did because they didn't. At least, like to say that Plato doesn't believe in it as much as we thought, that's ridiculous. Plato was the first guy to make an argument for it. And in fact, Diotima is actually one of only 3 women that appear in a very important roles in Plato's dialogues. The first is, and it just happens to be, on my view, in the dialogue directly in front of the Symposium, where a woman who was the mistress of the great orator Pericles appears. Her name is Aspasia, and she appears because she's Socrates' teacher in rhetoric. So first of all, the idea that Plato is against rhetoric, well, why is Socrates going to Aspasia to learn rhetoric? Now, Aspasia makes this wonderful speech filled with truths and falsehoods that demonstrates a very important part of Platonic pedagogy, which is that even a person that's speaking falsehoods is of great pedagogical value because the student has to be able to sift the true from the false. And of course, you get that in the Symposium by its variety. Plato is so great an artist, he doesn't need that kind of variety to make it. He can have one character say some things that are true. And by the way, Diotima falls into that category as well. But Diotima, at the peak of her speech, represents really one of the key moments in all of Plato, which is, well, as I called it in my book, the ascent to the beautiful. In other words, the rise up to an absolutely transcendent idea of what is beautiful, and that's entrusted to Diotima. But that's a theme that comes back in a number of dialogues of Plato, probably the greatest dialogues of Plato, the Republic, the Phaedo, the ones that are the most Platonic in the sense that they rise up to the Platonic idea. But in a way, the most important woman in the Platonic dialogues is Socrates' own mother, whose name is Phainarete, who's a midwife. And Socrates says that he learned all of his skill from his mother and that he's a midwife too, only he doesn't help women give birth to human children. He principally helps young men give birth to bright ideas. And that one of his arts is that when a youngster says something that's bullcrap, that he is capable of refuting it and showing that it's bullcrap. But when it's something that is worthy of more attention and seriousness, that he can nurture that. And that as a midwife, he is responsible for helping to give birth to beautiful ideas, especially in youngsters as a teacher. So this idea of entrust, so that's kind of the feminist approach, which is a true reality in Plato. So that's the first part of your answer to your question. The other thing that I would emphasize, Plato's a teacher, and that there's, any good teacher will at some point in their career have used an example where they themselves were taught. And they will tell their students about how Mrs. Jenkins or the traffic cop or Mr. Williams taught them some very valuable lesson when they were a kid, and that they will tell the story of what an idiot they were until Mr. Williams straightened them out with his finger in his face and told them never to do that again. And that for the teacher to admit that the teacher was taught, when the teacher manifests like some, German professor, as if, there's nothing. Well, I mean, the famous one is about the English professor named Benjamin Jowett, where there's a little rhyme about him that goes, I'm Benjamin Jowett of Balliol College, and if I don't know it, it just isn't knowledge. Well, nobody wants a teacher like that, quite frankly. And of course, that's the beauty of Socrates. We got this midwife who professes to know very little, who's not a good speaker. I feel so intimidated because I have to go after Agathon, who then presents himself as being schooled by Diotima. It's this charmingly, what would I say, self-deprecating technique. And of course, it passes on to Plato, because Plato's not saying anything in his own voice. He's not saying, I'm a noble guy connected to Solon on my mother's side. I came from one of the best born families in Athens. I was rich, good looking, tall. I was a great athlete. Like, he doesn't say any of that crap. He doesn't do any boasting. He hides himself completely in the dialogue. By the way, all those things are true. All those things are true. We know those independently. We don't know them through him, though. He'd rather be the theme for praise than praise himself. So that idea of the teacher being taught, Plato's already explored this idea on the very question, by the way, of the beautiful, where Socrates pretends that he has this neighbor that's always giving him a hard time and asking him tough questions and saying, aren't you ashamed of yourself, Socrates, to talk about what's good and what's beautiful, and you don't even know what the beautiful is? Where everybody that's ever read the dialogue, The Greater Hippias, knows that that's just Socrates himself, pretending that he's being taught by his neighbor. In fact, it's the first time in the dialogues where it's very obvious that Plato is deliberately using deception, because Socrates is pretending that he's being taught by somebody that clearly he's not being taught by. And so by the time we get to the Diotima passage, we've been schooled in Socrates being schooled already. But it's a wonderful pedagogical device. And by having it be a woman, it not only ties back to the Menexenus, the dialogue that immediately precedes it, but that it is also deeply tied into Plato's feminism, because Plato clearly thinks that men and women are equal. And by the way, as a teacher, I can tell you that since virtually every woman knows what it's like to be objectified in a physical sense and to be judged only on the basis of her physical appearance with scant regard to whatever is inside, is that women tend to pick up on Platonism quicker than boys do, quite frankly, because they've experienced that. They've experienced being misjudged on the seeming versus being, on the physical versus spiritual so often that when they see somebody coming along and say that the true object of beauty is this intangible idea, which is neither male nor female, that it's almost as if they know it. And to just go a little bit deeper into that women and men thing, the reason that huper apothnesken, that appears in the speech of Phaedrus and in the speech of Diotima, the classic example of huper apothnesken is childbirth, where a woman goes through a horrible period, often of 9 months, climaxing with a skeletal crisis of actually giving birth, in which many women throughout the centuries and even today die in childbirth. That what are they doing? They are hyper apothnesken. They are dying on behalf of their child. And the false thing, by the way, that Diotima says is that she tries to ground the love of the beauty in parents who are willing to die on behalf of their offspring. And the reason that the speech of Phaedrus is so important is that the parents of Admetus aren't willing to die for him. They aren't willing to die for him. It's his wife Alcestis who's willing to die for him. And that makes her the fourth great woman in the dialogues of Plato, because she represents the perfect example of what it really means to act in accordance with the gallant with the beautiful, with the excellent, with the noble by, as another great man would say, for greater love hath no man than and he lays down his life for his friends, to which I think Plato might modify, and Cicero in his wake, is that greater love hath no man greater than a woman who is responsible for your existence, young fellow, and that she was willing to lay down her life for you. There's a passage that I wrote about in my book where Vince Lombardi, the great football coach, said, in all of life, there is nothing more noble than a man who, having given his all on the field, left it all on the field, lies on the field of battle victorious. And to me, I mean, Vince Lombardi, his sexism probably went with the territory. The thing that Vince fails to understand is that every human being that's ever lived is the result of a woman lying on a field of battle, having given her all, victorious or not, by her willingness to act in accordance with the noble, which is what the dialogue is all about. So why does Plato give this to Diotima? All of the above.
Wow, it's beautiful and very powerful. It brings a lot of other questions to mind, but I want to stay on track. And
Thank you.
many questions opened up there.
We can come back if you want.
Yeah, definitely. I'm making notes here on the side. But I mean, so on the topic of Diotima, obviously, many people will know the term Diotima's ladder of love. That's what one of the major themes that is associated with this text. And so, it's this ascent from the love of a single body, ultimately resulting in the beauty itself. So, can you walk us through that ascent and what is the person on that ladder experiencing?
Well, he's a great teacher. So, in a way, the Buddha was the greatest teacher, in the sense that, when he came up with little things like life is pain, pain is desire, desire can be eliminated. It can be eliminated by following the Eightfold Path. And then you get into the Eightfold Path, which is kind of like, well, right knowledge, right intention, right speech, right action, right, where they all, when you actually think about them, they just lead into each other. Well, that's what the scala amoris, as it's called in Latin. You fall in love with a beautiful body, right? It's like high school romance. She's the only boy, he's the only boy, the only girl, the only whatever for me. And then you meet the Playboy magazine stages, sexual development, where it's beautiful bodies in general that you love. And then you realize that the love of bodies is just, that all of it pales when you fall in love, when you find your Juliet or your Romeo, and you fall in love with one beautiful soul. And many people are just happy to have, keep only one person happy and you'll be happy too, with Jimmy Durante. So that's the love of just one beautiful soul. But then, especially if you're a teacher, you go from one beautiful soul to many beautiful souls, and then you realize that to really bring out the beauty of souls, that there's certain things that bring that out. Beautiful topics of conversation. So, for example, the sorts of stuff we were just talking about, like when we talk about Vince Lombardi and the woman in childbirth, or things like that, that there's certain topics that kind of bring out the natural nobility. So if somebody says, women are, like, you can imagine somebody like poo-pooing the argument that I just made. And saying, no, human nature is basically selfish. Come on, haven't you read your Hobbes and your Darwin? What's this? You're saying that human nature is like giving up the good for somebody. Come on, yeah. So there are certain topics that if you've got any nobility of character, it will come out. I remember when I was a kid, I went to a movie. It was Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy, where Spencer Tracy's this absolutely noble character. And I remember walking out with my friend Rich Bassett, just saying, I don't want to know anybody that didn't love that movie. Like if you're not moved by that movie, like I don't know you. The examples that I would use are, I would use It's a Wonderful Life. So a lot of people have seen It's a Wonderful Life. So if you watch A Wonderful Life with somebody, if they're not deeply moved by that, if they don't understand what this is, that this Jimmy Stewart character who professes to hate the silly little Bedford Falls and yet gives his life for it, if you don't see the nobility and grandeur of that, if that doesn't bring a tear to your eye, or if you don't get emotional about, in other words, there's certain topics that bring out, certain movies, let's say, that bring out one's natural capacity to love the beautiful. Because Plato's at war with the group that he called the Sophists, but as far as he's concerned, there are plenty of Sophists around today. In other words, anybody trying to say, look, as Vince Lombardi would say, nice guys finish last. Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing. So Vince Lombardi, I'll use him not just as an example of sexism, but as an example of just modern sophistry. That Plato knows that a lot of us have been brought up with that, and we're always going to be brought up with that. But there's certain things that might encourage others to give birth to the beautiful, certain topics. And this is kind of where the teacher comes in, because there's certain topics that will lead you to finally realize that what you were in love with all the time was not the one beautiful body or the many beautiful bodies or the beautiful soul that you had those first conversations with, or the conversations even themselves, that the thing that really was attracting you all the time, towards which your eros was really directed, is something completely external to yourself that he called the idea of the beautiful. And that when you catch sight of that, it transforms your life, because you don't think you're the center of things anymore. You're not a materialist anymore. You're not guided by what everybody says anymore. You're thinking for yourself about what's really true. But of course, to actually lead somebody up to that, and to get them to see it. If you think you can get somebody to actually, I can tell you that the screenwriters that wrote It's a Wonderful Life, it wasn't like they were devoid of rhetoric. They knew how to make great speeches. Don't you see, George? You've really had, every boy on that troop ship died because Harry wasn't there to save him, because you weren't there to save Harry. That's classic rhetoric coming out of the mouth of the angel. So it's not like we can dispense with rhetoric if we're really going to get to the beautiful and the good. But that if we think that educational training is training in rhetoric without any awareness of the beautiful and the good, then we're going to be stuck in the realm of the sophists that Plato called the cave forever and ever. Amen. Except no amen at the end of it. Just ever and ever non-amen.
You mentioned something in your book, or you highlight this fact that in Diotima's teaching, she seems to swap out the beautiful for the good. Um,
Hmm.
so can you speak a little bit about the interchangeability of the two terms? Is there a strategic reason for why those are swapped?
Oh yeah, my gosh. Well, that's a complicated question, and it simply can't be answered without thinking about the dialogues as a whole. In other words, um, that let me see how I would put it. By the time that Plato was writing his dialogues and creating a school that he called the Academy, Athens had already demonstrated tremendous nobility, especially in the Persian Wars, fighting by themselves, roughly speaking, at Marathon against a huge invasion force from Asia. And the idea of nobility, the idea of the noble, of being able to, if every Greek during Plato's time was not prepared to huper apothnesken for the sake of the city or the good or the beautiful, they all at least knew what it was. They had heard about it. It was part of their mythology, just the same way I cannot tell a lie, or the little hatchet in the cherry tree, or whatever is part of our mythology. Or I regret only that I have but one life to give for my country, as the school teacher Nathan Hale said. So we know what the noble is. It's very difficult to do the noble. It's difficult to jump on that hand grenade. It's difficult to give birth. It's difficult to actually sacrifice yourself for another person. But it's easy to understand the concept. We all kind of understand the concept, so that when somebody sacrifices themselves for others, we understand that that's a good and a noble thing to do. Although maybe Vince Lombardi and his disciples will say that's stupid. And in fact, I think our president has said that kind of thing about people that were captured, or I can't remember all the whole John McCain dialogue back there. But I mean, there is, if you have a cult of winning, I guess you can get away from the noble. But no, we all know what it is. Now, in my series of books, the first volume, which I wrote last, as you mentioned, is called Ascent to the Beautiful, because the first dialogues climaxing with the Symposium lead you up to the beautiful, to the noble. The second volume is called Ascent to the Good. And while it's very easy to say that the beautiful and the good are the same thing, which is what you mean when you say that Diotima swaps them out. In fact, it's a key move in the Protagoras where they get swapped out. In fact, there's a triple swap out in the Protagoras where the beautiful is the good is the pleasant, so therefore the beautiful is the pleasant. And in fact, that leads to the great paradox that going to war and dying in war is pleasant because it's beautiful. Well, it's beautiful because it's good, because the pleasant is the good. Anyway, so all of these swap out equations are really important to Platonic pedagogy. What makes the swap out of the beautiful for the good so important is that the good really has two meanings. The good can mean the good for me. And that's what's easy for Socrates to answer when questioned by Diotima, because the good for me is happiness. So like when she says, what do you get when you get the beautiful? Socrates says, well, I don't really know. Like what comes into being for a guy that has the beautiful? I don't really know. Because he knows that like a guy that jumps on a hand grenade is behaving on the basis of the beautiful. But what do you get from that? A posthumous Medal of Honor, a dead widow, a widow, like what, or husband, what do you get? Whereas with the good, if the good is the good for me, you get happiness. And in the dialogues after the Symposium leading up to the Republic, remember the central idea in the Republic, the central idea in Plato is not the idea of the beautiful. That's a way station halfway between Protagoras and the Republic. The most important idea in Plato is the idea of the good, which is the climax of the great Platonic image of the cave, where you exit from the world of the sophists and the world of the body and of seeming and of lies and actually see what is truly good outside of the cave. So it has long been pondered by scholars why Plato says so little about the idea of the good. Like, is it harmony? Is it unity? What is it? What is it? And what I learned in writing these books is I believe I discovered the secret of why Plato says so little about the idea of the good. It goes back to this swap out of the good for the beautiful in the Symposium, which is that what the idea of the good is that it's not the good for me. It's not happiness. It's not the Aristophanic notion of what belongs to you, of what is intrinsically yours by your ancient nature. That's not what it is. It's something external. It's something transcendent. It's that which motivates self-sacrificing, altruistic action. That's what it is. It's precisely not that which, but to get a person a man. Look, Plato's greatest student was Aristotle, his most famous student. I don't want to say greatest. I personally think his greatest student was Demosthenes and Cicero and Philo and Plutarch. But let's not get Aristotle goes down in history as the famous one. And of course, he was a more famous philosopher than any of those people that I just mentioned as greater Platonists. So, and of course, what he says is that the good is happiness. We're motivated by happiness. And many Plato scholars have thought that Plato too was a happiness-centric guy. The Greek word for happiness is eudaimonia. The phrase for a person that values happiness is the highest good is a eudaimonist. And Plato appears to be a eudaimonist in many, many passages. The most famous relate to something like we used to say when I was a kid. Somebody would say, "Hey man, how you doing?" And you'd say, "I'm doing good." Maybe if you were a private school pointy-headed fellow like me, you'd say, "I'm doing well," but just to preserve the grammar. But in that very, how you doing? I'm doing good. Okay, when you say I'm doing good, that doesn't mean I'm a philanthropist that just gave away $20 million to save the Children Cancer Foundation. It doesn't mean I'm literally doing good things right now. It means I'm doing good. In other words, I'm cool, I'm happy, I'm feeling no pain, things are going well. So this joke is built into Greek. The words eupraten, which literally mean to do well, and literally are applied to, like, the doctor does medicine well, or the flute player does flute playing well. That's not the way it's colloquially used in Greek. It's colloquially used in Greek meaning I'm doing good. Eupraten means I'm doing good. So, like in a dialogue after the Symposium, like the Euthydemus, where Socrates says, "Don't all people wish to eupraten?" That has been taken by the eudaimonist readers of Plato, of which there are many, especially in the English-speaking world, who want to turn Plato and Socrates into eudaimonists. That's just been taken as proof. Here's Socrates in this dialogue, the Euthydemus, saying all men desire to be happy. In other words, to eupraten, to do well, to be happy. Therefore, QED. Now, the problem, the fact that the Euthydemus is filled to the brim with kind of specious, false, fallacious, and deliberately fallacious arguments at the hands of these two morons named Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus, and is just filled to the brim with fallacy. That has not stopped people from wanting to, maintain, get their teeth into the swap out in Symposium too. Doesn't Plato, look, even in Diotima, look at it, swaps it out for the. Now, the fact that that swap out doesn't end up running through the speech, and by the end of the speech, he's really answering what comes into being, if you see the beautiful. That's the ascent of the ladder of love, where she leaves this whole happiness thing behind. So I don't want to say that swap out stands in the Symposium, but to understand why Plato does it in the Symposium would involve a trip that would take us through the Lysis and the Euthydemus and the Laches and the Charmides and the Gorgias and the Theages and the Meno, all the way through the Cleitophon up to the Republic. We would actually have to do a lot more to understand why he does that.
So Diotima, as you're referencing, right? She says that what love wants is to give birth in beauty, right? So the vision of beauty itself puts the individual in the position of being capable of giving birth to true virtue. So, there's also this question in the history of philosophy and in different religions, can can one intellectually or rationally arrive at the vision of the beautiful or the good and be transformed by that, or is it act or grace, right? So what does that mean? What is it? Is it something that can be taught, or does it require something more? Does it require that act of love maybe on part of the teacher?
Well,
Um,
certainly it does that. Certainly, when he talks about giving birth in the beautiful, he's really talking about engendering beautiful ideas in the student. I don't think there's any question about that. That he's a teacher, and that you won't go wrong if you understand that teaching is his paradigm for what is a virtuous activity, and that the variety and the vivacity all play in to the pedagogy. Now the Platonic pedagogy is a different story. So when you write a dialogue where your lead character says virtue can't be taught, and where your lead character says that imitation is ipso facto bad, and where your lead character says that writing is a waste of time and no serious person puts their mind into it, and where your lead character says that rhetoric is bad, even in a dialogue where he makes eloquent speeches against eloquence, is that when you're dealing with that kind of thing, you're going to split your student body. And I don't mean the way Aristophanes says Zeus splits our bodies. You're going to split your audience down maybe not even down the middle. The overwhelming majority are going to take you literally, as the overwhelming majority of Plato scholars have taken these statements literally, and have not acknowledged that the basis of Platonic pedagogy is to challenge students to discover what is false. The critique of writing in the Phaedrus, when Plato through Socrates attacks writing in the Phaedrus, what he says is that the problem with writing is that once you write it down, it keeps saying the same thing to everybody. It doesn't know how to speak to the wise as opposed to the foolish. It keeps saying the same thing over and over and over again. You can't ask it any questions. And it just keeps on saying the same thing to all and sundry, which is not the way to operate. Well, my view is that Plato created a form of writing that of which that was not true. So that when he said rhetoric is bad, maybe many people will accept that he thinks that rhetoric is bad, but some people will realize that he's not. I would compare that to going through the looking glass. When you suddenly see that it's not exactly how it appears to be, that Plato's quite a different teacher from, he's no Aristotle. He's not just laying out what he thinks is true for your benefit. He's writing dialogues that are challenging you to think for yourself, and that whatever else he is, he can be the deceptive Aspasia, he can be the inspirational Diotima, but he's always the midwifery of finarete, and that you are the subject. You are the subject of his art. And now whether you fall in love with It's a Wonderful Life, or whether you decide that, Captain's Courageous is a stupid ass movie and that I don't like Spencer Tracy, like that's up, as my drill sergeant in the Army used to say, that's entirely up to you people. I don't care a goddamn bit how you do it, BRM. That's entirely up to you people. That's entirely up to you. And that's the essence of Platonic pedagogy right there. Except that he does give a damn. Like he's really giving his all to get you to come up the right way, but he knows he can lead you to water, but he can't make you drink. He can't do it. The simple way to understand Platonic pedagogy is to say that Plato invented the multiple choice question. That's basically what it boils down to. What is the multiple choice question? The multiple choice question is you say all the following statements are true of Harry S. Truman except, and then they give you, several. He dropped the atomic bomb, like he tried to break a coal strike. That the art of the maker of the multiple choice question has to figure out at least one question that's so plausibly accurate and yet the wrong answer that it really will challenge the student to find the one answer that's true. Remember, only one answer in the multiple choice is true. Maybe one of them can be quickly ruled out, maybe even two, but a good one will have something deceptive, will have something that you think, if you don't think about it carefully. This is what Plato did. He created a whole series of characters, other than Socrates primarily, that people would think were just speaking the truth, and that they would think that Socrates was speaking the truth even when he wasn't, like in the Euthydemus, when he says, all men desire to euprotein. He's already taught you that euprotein is a fallacy. He's already taught you that it's double meaning. But not everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. People want, part of what makes Plato a classic is that we've come to expect from our philosophers that, they're thoughtful guys that have spent a lot of time thinking about what's true and that they're going to teach it to you. And when you read Aristotle, that is what he's doing. He's teaching you. He's just telling you the way it is. And a lot of people have liked that. He's the leading pedagogue for, he taught the Catholic Church how to think. Through Thomas Aquinas. What makes Plato a classic is he doesn't teach that way. He's not teaching that way. I think Aristotle wanted him to be teaching that way, and Aristotle assumed he was teaching that way And we can see that because Aristotle himself teaches that way, but no, not Plato. He gives you this infinite variety and vitality. And who does he like? Does he like Agathon? Does he like Aristophanes? Maybe he likes Alcibiades the best. You're challenged. And what's really going on is that Plato has just invented the kind of ancient equivalent of the Rorschach ink blot. He passes you this abstract thing called a Platonic dialogue and says, hey, what do you see in this thing? What do you see in it?
Hmm.
And some people will say, I see a degenerate Athenian society that's got a lot of gay people in it. Like, let's nuke it. And then other people will have a different reaction. So that he knows that, and that it's a challenge. So to answer your question, that while believing that virtue can be taught, he knows that it will not be the instrumentality of his own teaching that gets you there. That the best he can do is to create a highly creative, complex, self-contradictory series of statements that if you are really thoughtful, you will be led by those questions and self-contradictions to the truth. But whether you get there or not, with due respect to my friend Staff Sergeant Denny Hill, that's entirely up to you people. That's entirely up to you.
So perfect transition there to Alcibiades. So at the philosophical peak of the text, then Alcibiades bursts in drunk, crowned with ivy and ribbons, and completely changes the energy of the dialogue. So instead of praising love, he gives a speech praising Socrates. So what's going on there?
Well, once again, it's a question that implicates not only other Platonic dialogues, but also implicates a much broader subject of Athenian history in general and Plato's place in that. So, with those two more general things being said, let's go back to the standalone reading of the Symposium for a minute. First of all, it's funny. Alcibiades is funny. Like you say, he comes bursting. Plato writes him as if he's drunk. You can hear that he's drunk from the way that he writes. So he's already given you, a serious pederast in Pausanias and this Gorgionic tragedian in Agathon and this brilliant comic poet in Aristophanes and this kind of pre-Socratic physicist in Eryximachus and this very sweet boy in Phaedrus and this brilliant guy in Socrates. And then you get this kind of drunken, and he's not dumb. He's funny and he tells wonderful stories. And so just like leaving aside all of Athens and leaving aside the other Platonic dialogues, it just works on a brilliantly comic level. It's just funny and breaking up the party and it's kind of rule bound, take your turns, stuff. The hiccuping has probably been the funniest thing until, drunken Alcibiades shows up and he just blows the hiccups out of the water. So just on the level of the Symposium, it's just extremely amusing. Now, with that said, you got a wider context. So look, the dialogue that I think is first begins with Alcibiades, and it starts out as this dialogue between Socrates and this friend of his. And the friend says, hey, where you been, Socrates? Oh, no, don't tell me. I'll bet you've been chasing after that beautiful boy, Alcibiades. I'll bet that you've been hunting him like you always are. I once was teaching the Protagoras in Bogota, in Colombia. And the translation that we were using was by a Jesuit. Very nice translation, by the way. But he put a footnote on this beginning passage in which he assured his naive, don't be fooled don't be fooled by this homoerotic language into thinking that Socrates was homosexual. Don't think that Plato. We know from the Symposium. That Socrates did not have sex with Alcibiades, and so fear not, my children. Like, even though this language might seem to be homoerotic, it really isn't. Well, my response is that when you first encounter the Protagoras, you haven't read the Symposium yet. So that every little kid and every adolescent, especially the ones that are in the back of the room saying, what is this Altman guy like? What's this Plato fetish he's got? Is he in love with Plato himself? What's that? And his Socrates. Woody Allen's got like in Love and Death. It's like the idea that Socrates was a homosexual is like Woody Allen says it in a very memorable way in that movie. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make then is that you don't like. Okay, so the first thing that I said, Joshua, was that the Symposium is teaching Platonic love. Well, now what is Platonic love? It isn't sexual. It it's not homosexual. It's not heterosexual. It's not sexual. It's the love of something greater, where two people share a love for something else. Like, for example, I love watching It's a Wonderful Life with you, honey. Like let's go to the opera together, or let's look at a sunset, or whatever. In other words, where we share our love for something external to ourselves, the beautiful at its highest form. What happens in the Symposium is that by showing that the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades is not the homoerotic relationship, not only that we thought it was, but is not the homoerotic relationship that Plato has made us suspect that it was in the Protagoras, in the dialogues named after Alcibiades, of which there are two. We've read all of those before we come to the Symposium. And so when we actually find that the object of Alcibiades' love was never the beautiful or the good or the just or the righteous, but was Socrates himself, who he tried to get into bed and tried to seduce. And Socrates said, no, no, no. You don't seem to understand what's going on here, Sonny. That's not what we're here for. Is that at the same time that an issue that he has used to whet, with an H, to whet adolescent sexual interest, in other words, the precise nature of the relationship, sexual or otherwise, between Socrates and Alcibiades, at the very moment that he disabuses you of its sexual character, is the moment where he teaches you what Platonic love is. Platonic love is not that. That's not what that is. And so there's a level on the lowest, most juvenile adolescent level that any kid can get, including the kids in the back row that don't pay much attention, that sit back there and say, I dare you, Mr. Altman, to say anything that interests me. And believe me, I've had many of them. Takes them and teaches them what Platonic love is. And that the more they were adolescent, the more they'll get it. Like the more they were insistent on this, the more they'll be flipped and flipping a student. That's what every great teacher has to be able to do. You have to take the kid that comes into your class and say, hey, Mr. Altman, you act like you're teaching us the truth. There's no truth. There's no truth. Everything's a matter of opinion. You have yours, I have mine. Who's to say? That this is the typical sophomoric attitude. And what a great teacher has to do is flip that kid, flip him. And excuse me, Mr. Ben. So when you say everything is a matter of opinion and there is no truth, are you saying that's true? Oh, so it's true there's no truth? Oh, interesting. So it's not just your opinion that everything is a matter of opinion? How do you?
So it's interesting because Alcibiades compares Socrates to the statue of Silenus, right? And he says that, this ugly statue, but on the inside contains all these golden images of the gods. And so um, I guess maybe in that theme of the flipping, right? And in this case, this is the tragedy of Alcibiades because he ends up not flipping, but
Yeah.
his love for the person of Socrates allows him, he gets a glimpse inside of Socrates because he can kind of see he sees beyond the appearance of what Socrates portrays himself as. And so there's something, I don't know, there's something there as well, this image that became very popular of Silenus and the little golden statues inside. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, look, the chief problem with being a charismatic teacher is that there are certain people that are going to think you're the bomb. And one of the major reasons that it's important to use a device like everything I learned I was taught by Diotima is that it's self-deprecating, and that the teacher that sets themselves up as a guru and acts as if they can put their students in touch with the deepest truths, this is a person that needs to be watched. That Gregory Vlastos was famous for attacking the view of love in the Symposium because he said it was so impersonal. It's not the love of another person. It's by bringing in this idea of beauty and this. It's not real love. And I think that what Vlastos forgot is that Plato was a teacher. You know, not having a love relationship with your students is what might be called an academic best practice. In other words, that there's a real reason why Plato is saying no. It's like no. Alcibiades clearly did fall in love with Socrates. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. And Socrates does everything that he can to push it away, as Plato does. Push it away. There's something else that you were in love with, something else higher, pointing away. And it's not always easy for a teacher to do that because we all have an ego and all of us want to be happy. But in terms of what's going on with the Alcibiades incident, I think, is that like Aristophanes, he's incapable of seeing the truly good as outside of another human being. Whereas I think Plato was insistent. And by the way, as the dialogues proceed, in the Theaetetus and then in the dialogues that follow, is that this was one of the central questions. Plato was very, very well aware. I mean, maybe one way to put it is that when Plato created the academy, that there were a couple of routes that he could have taken. He could have set himself up as the sage, the guru of Athens, the wise man that takes the students and teaches them the truth. And by the way, many views of Plato have tried to configure him as that. The Anglo-American world, it prefers more to emphasize the skeptical side of Plato, the Socrates who says he knows, or even knows that he knows nothing, but in any case, doesn't know much. So there's the skeptical, maybe you can get there, maybe you can, I don't know. And then there's the come into my office and I'll put you in touch with God here, Sonny, is that Plato does neither of those things. And the closest that he comes to having any little golden trinkets inside his soul is that he doesn't answer that. Like he doesn't choose one or the other. He's not divine. He doesn't have the golden trinkets that Alcibiades thinks that he has, but he's not going to rule those out. He's not going to rule out that you can get there. So walking that line, and after all, we know that Plato wasn't Plato's name. Plato's name was Aristocles, which you can't get a much more aristocratic name than Aristocles, the son of Ariston. He chose to call himself Plato. And we understand the word Plato best when we think of it as Plato. And that plateau, dividing the absolute truth from us down here, that he captured so beautifully in the image of the cave. Plato is that plateau. He's not the guru of Athens. He's not the sage. He's not Plotinus. But he's also not Sextus Empiricus. He's metaxi. He's between, and negotiating for those that have the capacity, the will, the desire, the eros, to look beyond him to what is eternal and true. And that's why he's a deathless and immortal teacher, because he'll continue to be doing that till the end of time. And when we start to be Plato's students, we not only realize that he loves us in particular, because we've seen through the looking glass, but that we love him. We love him for having done that. So even though dead for several thousand years, he remains a living presence for those that he loves and those that love him.
Mm. Beautiful. There's one last question that I want to ask in terms of the dialogue itself, because we come to the point at the end where everyone has fallen asleep.
Yeah.
And Socrates is still awake, and he's arguing that when we touched upon this in the beginning, that the same person should be able to
Yeah.
write both comedy and tragedy, and then even those interlocutors that he has fall asleep, and then he goes on about his day, right? And in the beginning of the text, we see that he shows up in a very unique way, right? That he's bathed, he's put on his sandals. And so he shows up in a unique way and he leaves in a very unique way. And so there's also something kind of ethereal about him or sagacious about him that you might say, right? Like what can be said about the ending of the dialogue of Plato just after having drunk, or Socrates after having been drinking all the night, he takes you through this roller coaster ride, and then he just gets up and goes about his day. And
Well, I don't know. I think that one of the great merits of Alcibiades' speech is that he gives us a portrait of Socrates that we haven't seen in the dialogues up to that point so far, because he tells a number of stories about Socrates as a soldier. And probably the most ethereal moment really is not actually it's not actually what Socrates does when he drinks these other guys under the table and then goes on about his day. I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, I admit that this, having the tragedian on one side, the comedian on the other side, they're both kind of nodding off asleep. Aristodemus, the source of the story, can't really follow it very closely, but to the best of his recollection, he was trying to teach them that a true comedian could write a tragedy, etc. And then he goes on his way, although he's drunk just as much as they have, and went to the Lyceum as just if it was a normal day. I mean, you're right. I get all of that. But when Alcibiades talks about what it was like in Podidea, where Socrates went around barefoot in the snow, and where there was a medal that was awarded to Alcibiades solely on the basis of what Socrates had done. And when at the retreat from Delium, he was the one that had saved the life of Laches, the general, Socrates, the soldier, who, in confronted with a problem, stands stock still all night there in Podidea until the sun comes up. That, I think, is probably the most ethereal moment in the dialogue, because we wonder about what the hell was he thinking about when he did that. That although we're moving into a phase where I fear very much that the entire word pre-Socratic philosophy is going to fade out of the education of mankind. Certainly some efforts have been made along those lines recently by two fellows by the name of Most and Lax. And I think I can't really think of how to put Lax and Most together, but they lack most of what I think is important by trying to get away from pre-Socratic philosophy. Pre-Socratic philosophy was like Anaximachus. It was about material. It was about, what is everything made of? It's all made of water, said Thales. It's all made of air. Pre-Socratic philosophy is what Socrates didn't do. And Socratic philosophy, if pre-Socratic philosophy, as Aristotle famously said, begins with wonder, Socratic philosophy begins with wondering about Socrates, because he's this incredibly interesting Athenian character. Not rich, not poor, not wise, not foolish, everything he should be, everything he shouldn't be. This soldier, poet, shod in nice sandals on this particular night, unlike his typical agora haunting, as you've emphasized in several of your questions. This enigmatic, delightful, confusing, self-contradictory individual, Silenus, if you will, where you keep taking off the layers and finding different things as far as you go. I think that, Plato's goal was to turn you into a better human being, to teach you how to be virtuous. And he thought that, speculating about how the universe came into being in the Big Bang and how we all evolved out of creatures that came out of the primal slime was probably not the best way to teach people how to become virtuous. And that rather showing a guy that tried to model virtue and that did and seems to have taught it and died for having tried to teach it was a pretty good way of getting people to think more deeply about what kind of life they actually should want to live. And the fact that Alcibiades chose the life of fame, fortune, treason, and all the other bad things, including power, just goes to show that, you could hang around with him and come to the wrong conclusions, which shouldn't surprise anybody that understands that it's entirely up to you and always was entirely up to you. And that I've handed you these dialogues for you to make the best of them that you can. I don't think it would surprise Plato at all to know that most people today are paying more attention to the speeches of Aristophanes and Alcibiades than they are to Diotima. Yeah, because one of the things that makes Plato so wonderful, Joshua, is that it's not just that we're reading this great old guy, he's a great writer, variety, stuffed with most excellent differences. It's not just that he's like this highly creative, brilliant dude. What each age sees in him, what our age currently sees in him, says a lot more about us than it says about him. These guys have been around for a long time, and we think that we're judging them. We think we're making a decision about them. In a way, it's like God. It's like we sit around and wonder whether God exists. Like, does God exist? And like some ages they're big on God, and other ages they're not so big on God. Well, how would that look for God from God's perspective? It's like, you idiots. Like, you're wondering about whether I exist. Like, come on, dude. You were in diapers 20 minutes ago, and you're going to be 6 foot under tomorrow. So, and you're wondering about whether I exist. Up yours. Come on. And Plato and these classics in a way are the same kind of thing. They're not going away. They're not going away. They're not going any. Yeah, we can read them the way they read them in Oxford or Cambridge or Tübingen or Milan or Cambridge or Princeton. But the way they read them at Princeton in 2020 is different from the way they're going to read them in Princeton in 2120, or the way they read in Princeton in 1920. And so these things keep changing. And Plato is going to be the same text. It's going to be the same text. And what we find in it is going to be, largely up to us. What I tried to do was to look at all of Plato, not to get rid of a quarter of his corpus, the way the German scholars have done since the 19th century, to take him as a whole, to think of him as a teacher, and to think of his dialogues as his teaching tools, and to try to figure out on the basis of those not implausible suggestions, kind of what he was doing and teaching. You asked me at the beginning why. I don't know. I think one of the things that I can say, and since I'm an old man, I'm willing to say it, is that I think you're at a real disadvantage as a Plato scholar, not only if you don't have a good sense of humor. Like, you do have to have a good sense of humor. Well, I mean, let me give you an example of a good sense of humor. Like, take the book of Genesis, for example, where it's like, on the first day this was created, the second day was like, on the fourth day, yeah, God creates the sun, and there was morning and there was evening, a fourth day, which raises the question, like, what the fuck was the first and the second and the third day without a sun? Like, come on, like if a day can't be existent with a sun, and the sun only comes into being on the fourth day, I mean, come on. We don't have to extrapolate to the billions and billions of years of Carl Sagan to realize that Moses, whoever it was that wrote the book of Genesis, likewise had a sense of humor. Like, so yeah, you do have to have a sense of humor. There's no doubt about it, to get these kind of self-contradictory jokes. But I think it's fair to say that if you don't believe in anything higher than yourself, like if you don't believe in God, that's a real detriment to being a great Plato scholar. Like, if you really are an atheist and you've ruled out that there's anything transcendent, you've picked the wrong philosopher to study. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that have ruled that out and hold, full professorships at X, Y, and Z university. I was very fortunate to get my PhD when I was already 55 years old, and I had a thesis supervisor, a nice gal here in Brazil that was younger than I was, great Hegel scholar, who was an open-minded person. I don't think I could have gotten a PhD in Anglosphere, and I'm not trying to sell myself short. I think I'm a pretty good Plato scholar. It's just that my way of reading Plato was pretty out of the time. So I'm very grateful to my adopted country of Brazil for giving me the capacity to get a sheepskin. Not that the racists up in North America think very highly of a PhD from the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. Well, fuck them. Like the worst for them. That's just ignorance, of which there's no short supply. So why? I mean, my daddy, I can remember sitting on the floor with my daddy, and he like read me the death scene of Socrates in the Phaedo when I was like 6. So did that make me a Platonist? Was it maybe it was the fact that my mother actually had a guru that encouraged me to find some other route to the truth than gurudom, and that I found that somewhere. Plato was helpful in finding that. I don't know. It's deeply personal. What I do feel is looking back over my. I was thinking the other day. My name is William Henry Furness Altman. And I'm named after my great great grandfather. His name was William Henry Furness. And William Henry Furness was the childhood friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And like him was, what should I say? I've become kind of fond of AI, Joshua, because like the other day I sat down on my computer and I said, do transcendentalists believe in a transcendent God? And I got a really great answer to that. I was like, no, no, they don't. No, they don't. And like, why are they called transcendentalists? I asked AI. It was like, because they want human experience to kind of transcend the merely material, and they want to feel kinship and divine contact with all being. Well, William Henry Furness, but that on my mother's side, that's my mother's side, I was connected to this kind of guru of Athens thing, like this kind of get in touch with the divine. But my father was a Jew, that's kind of like, that's where the burning bush system goes. Take off your shoes, like. I am, not you. No Popeye the Sailor Man here. I am what I am, not you, jackass. And I think that that I think my becoming a Platonist was built into my DNA, in the sense that I had to mediate my mother and my father the way all of us do. But luckily, I was equipped with this Grand Canyon chasm between a very, very, very committed immanentist. God is in the flowers, God is in the guruism on my mother's side, and a kind of implicit, no, 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 put on your yarmulke, take off your shoes. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom on the other side. And that just happens to be a really good mix. You have to know the appeal of the rhetoric of the immanentist side to understand Plato. You've got to have it. You've got to thrill to it and love it and like it and see it. You've got to. But you also have to have that natural piety, which prevents you always. So I was I was thinking about those two movies, the It's a Wonderful Life, and the other one is The Wizard of Oz, that where the wizard says to the Tin Man about, you don't have a heart. And remember, my sentimental friend, a heart is not judged by how much you love, but by how much you are loved by others. That I think that Plato, who concealed himself, who didn't allow people to fall in love with him, was very wise. And when you ask me what I personally, now I think that I was naturally drawn to Plato for the reasons that I give, but I think that what I've learned from Plato was that I think I've learned why Plato wrote the Symposium the way he did. That the reason that Vlastos is wrong is because Plato was a teacher, and that the goal, as the Man of La Mancha says in the show of that, when he sings to dream the impossible dream, which by the way is a perfectly Platonic song, just a perfectly Platonic song. I've had the privilege of playing it on stage, which I felt was, hey, I'm being me. With that said, to love pure and chaste from afar, the wisdom of that, I think I've learned through Plato over the years. And Plato's my teacher. Well, quite apart from whether Plato is a teacher, I can tell you that Plato is my teacher, and that by treating him as a teacher, I have found him to be the very best of them. So I think that that would be my answer to your initial question. I kind of dodged it first.
Lovely. Yeah. The last thing that I'll ask, and then we'll wrap it up, is for the viewer that is approaching the text, maybe for the first time, maybe for the first time in a long time, or who is acquainted with the text, what advice do you have pragmatically for somebody who is engaging with this dialogue?
Well, look, the first thing I would say is that, you should sit down in a comfortable armchair where you don't have anything to do for the next 3 or 4 hours and read it at a sitting. The first time you read a Platonic dialogue, you should read it whole, no matter what anybody says or no matter how complicated it may be. Now, that doesn't go for the multi-book dialogues like the Laws in the Republic. They should be read one book at a time. But you should carve out some time, turn off your phone, turn out any distractions that you might have, and read them on your own to get your initial first reaction, and then to either write it down or jot it down or remember. My first impression on reading the Symposium was X, and that's you're never going to get that back. And it may change as you reread the text. One of the jokes about the critique of writing in the Phaedrus, where Socrates says the problem when we write something down is that it keeps saying the same thing over and over again, no matter how many times you read it. To which my initial response, even when I was a kid, was, have you ever read a Platonic dialogue twice? Like, have you ever taught a Platonic dialogue twice? Because I can tell you, you see something different in it every time you do. Nobody can read a Platonic dialogue and not seeing something different in it the second time, the third, fifth, 10th, 20th time they read it. They don't say the same thing every time you read it. That's the beauty of them. And that's why the critique of writing, so-called, does not apply. By the way, there's a whole school, get this, there's a whole school of Plato interpretation that not only takes the critique of writing seriously, but grounds its entire understanding of Plato on the absolute validity of the Schriftkritik, as the Germans call it. It's a German school coming out of Tübingen, that they literally do that. They literally do that. I don't want to single out the Germans. There's a whole school of Anglo-American Platonic studies that think that Plato is a eudaimonist, and think that that happiness is the highest good for Plato. So these things exist, but in every age, there's the opportunity to sit down and ask yourself what you think, to read these delightful dialogues, which are delightful. An adolescent can read every one of them, if read in the right order. I wouldn't recommend starting with the Laws, or even with the Theaetetus. But if you start with the Alcibiades Major, I can get a ninth grader to appreciate that just fine, let alone a senior. So giving yourself the opportunity to ask yourself what you liked in it. The question I ask when I go to a Plato conference, whenever I get into a conversation about Plato, my first question, whether they're a graybeard professor emeritus with 800 publications, or whether they're a kid trying to figure out what to write their master's thesis on, like whoever they may be, my question is always, what's your favorite Platonic dialogue? I say in this naive way, like because I can tell a lot from what they say. And if I get a few follow-up questions. So, asking yourself, if you didn't love It's a Wonderful Life, if you don't love that movie, if you just didn't like the Symposium, well, there are plenty of other philosophers to read that, Maybe Plato's not your cup of tea, but I think to give yourself the chance of not approaching it the way you would David Hume or the way you would Immanuel Kant, but just sitting down in a chair and reading it straight through, and asking these, not like, what was your favorite speech in the Symposium? What's your favorite moment? There's a great scene in the life of Jimmy Carter where he had graduated from the Naval Academy, and he wanted to go into the nuclear submarine program, and Hyman Rickover was the general there, short little guy sitting behind a desk who's interviewing Carter. And he said, what are you interested in, Ensign Carter? He said, well, I really like opera. And he said, well, what's your favorite opera? And he answered, and he said, what's your favorite scene in the opera? What's your favorite aria in the opera? What's your favorite line in the aria, your favorite aria? And at a certain point, he couldn't answer. And so Rickover said, well, let's move on. I see that you graduated 48th in your class at Annapolis. Why didn't you graduate higher? And Ensign Carter said, I suppose, sir, because I didn't always do my best. And Hyman Rickover said, why not? The interview's over, Ensign Carter. Jimmy Carter called his autobiography, Why Not the Best? It's like, why not the best? Uh, in When you come close to Plato, man, when a kid comes close to Plato, adolescents like to rebel. I used to say to my high school students, you want an act of rebellion? Drinking a six-pack of beer and wrecking a car. That's not an act of rebellion. That's what they expect. The insurance company is going to make money on you for doing that. That's not read an old book. That's an act of rebellion. So measure yourself against something that was written 3,000 years ago. That's what they don't want you to do, because you'll be thinking for yourself. You'll be seeing yourself and measuring yourself and your times against something that's got a standard to it. It's funny because you mentioned earlier about the flute girls, because there's this famous passage where he says, let's get rid of the flute girls, let's get rid of the flute. But Plato's dialogues are flute girls. Plato's dialogues are the most beautiful flute girls that ever played the flute. They're these delightful entertainments that are all designed to get you to understand yourself and the truth. To rise up to what is truly virtuous and excellent on your own. As beautiful as they too need to be transcended, as Plato does. But I think it's very important to sit down in the armchair with no distractions and just come close to this ancient world with no distractions, read it through, and then just ask yourself the most basic questions that Hyman Rickover asked Ensign Carter. What's your favorite part? What was your favorite part of that? What will stick in your mind? What was the most memorable? What did you most like? What did you most not like? And just those very simple, like you asking those questions, because it is up to you. And that if you talk to a professor that knows their stuff, and you say, well, my favorite speech was the moment in blah, 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 blah. Well, that's telling me a lot. And I can start teaching you right from that moment. And so can you. Because Joshua, these questions that you asked me and that you gave and prepared this thing with, just for the audience, he gave me this wonderful document of all these questions with questions, but he wrote this little thing after each of them. We called it the pathway, that were these really, really brilliant. All I can say, Joshua, is that you read my book with great care, and I really appreciate it. I really feel, there's a nice passage in St. Paul where he says, now we know in part, then shall we know, even as also we are known. I felt your questions have made me feel known by you. These are excellent questions. And your pathway hints to answering them were very, very useful. And I very, very much appreciate the opportunity that these questions have given me to be, after all, what I think is the most important thing for a person to be, which is to be. You've given me the opportunity to be myself. Thank you. It's like, as Langston Hughes said, the great African American poet, he said, I went to a costume party disguised as myself. Not one of my friends recognized. And I feel the exact opposite. I understand why the caged bird sings. Like, I understand why Langston Hughes, the tragedy of why he said that, and that's heartbreaking that he had to say that. But you made it possible for me just to be unalloyed myself, and I really appreciate that.
Well, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to be with you and to witness, all of these gems and pearls coming out of this deep ocean that, is your soul, all these things that you've collected and spent much time with, this half a lifetime, it sounds like, of time with Plato. And that's something to be lauded, something to be celebrated. So I'm happy that we can do it through this, and as much as you're grateful for, or you're a fan of AI, right? I'm also a fan of the fact that we can do this while you're in Brazil and I'm in California, and hopefully we can do it again, and maybe on a
I'd
different
love it.
topic. And
Look, on the basis of these questions, you want to You want to ask me anything about anything. These are excellent, excellent. I've been asked a lot of questions. One of the things about a teacher is that teachers are in the business of asking other people questions. And frankly, we don't get asked questions very often. I love being asked questions, and seldom, and I've been interviewed before. Seldom have I had anything like this kind of respectful, intelligent questions um, about something that is actually not that easy a book. You had clearly read it, and you were drawing not just from section 16 or 17, but like you had really read it, and it showed, and uh, uh, and I really really appreciate that. So if you ever want to have another session, I'm your man.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have to do it. I have many notes here that I took along the way. So I'm sure audience will love this. So thank you again for your time. And in Portuguese, Oxalá. Hopefully we will see you again.
Good. Bye bye.